to RCast, the official podcast to the RChain Cooperative. RChain is a complete, concurrent blockchain platform designed for maximum efficiency at minimal computational and environmental costs by utilizing proof of stake. I'm Derek Barris, the Director of Content for RChain. Each week on RCast, I'll be talking with the founders of our portfolio companies, as well as co-op members, staff, and other figures in the RChain ecosystem about the most pressing issues in blockchain today. Please check out rchain.coop to learn more about the platform, our community, validator sale, and information on becoming a member.
So Derek, you want to give us a quick introduction and then we'll kick off?
Well, I don't actually know what the topic is. I don't know which one this is.
Oh, okay. That's an even better. That's the best introduction of all. That's wonderful. Let's keep this in the podcast. Today's topic is proof of stake economics, because I think a lot of people haven't really thought through the proof of stake economics and what it implies. Like even Vlad has not actually thought through the macroeconomics of proof of stake. What's going to make proof of stake actually work, and how that dictates the market that we have to go into. The argumentation is really pretty clear, and it is mathematical, but it's mostly arithmetic. It's not, it's not like it's not like this crazy category theory that Mike and I have been slinging for the last 7 or 8 years now. The first piece of the argument that we're making is that, and this is the one that's really, really important to kind of grasp from the outset, and that's that proof of stake really requires a much larger volume of transactions. And this is basically because you don't have miners minting coin, and you don't necessarily have the same kind of token appreciation or the same kind of token appreciation dynamics. And then the other piece of this that is specific to the current market as opposed to the protocol is that you have all of these entities that are already wedded to proof of work and that have made large-scale infrastructure investments that don't necessarily lend themselves to other kinds of protocols, right? So you have all these people that have invested tens or hundreds of millions in special purpose hardware that is not necessarily easily repurposed to anything else.
As you're talking about that, I'm kind of thinking of like the oil industry, and kind of how there's been a lot of pressure to move towards like renewable energy, but the powers that be have built this infrastructure to like,
Yes.
produce the energy that they're producing, and they have no interest in it. So I feel like it's pretty similar in that regard.
That's a very good analogy, especially when you kind of extend the analogy, right? There's, highways and gas stations and all kinds of infrastructure. Yeah, it goes pretty deep, right? And that also has implications for supply chain management and logistics. So all of these industries are interwoven in a particular way, and so it's very hard to move the needle, to get people to move over in a particular way. Since we've got Steve on the call, I just want to see if that lands for you, Steve. Is that making sense to you?
Yes, it is. I mean, just a little interjection really. So I had this bizarre experience early in January where the University of the Third Age, as it is called in the UK, which is really university for people that are retired, my dad's in it and he's 88. They asked me to do a talk on blockchain to the science and technology group. So I go in there, and obviously I'm old enough to be their son, all of them. And I walk them through some of the hidden economics in the world of public blockchains. What was really interesting in my investigations into this was I looked at some public data about the Bitcoin blockchain, number of transactions per second, and some anecdotal evidence that people have often said that every day Bitcoin's blockchain expends about the same amount of energy as the entire island of Ireland. So I thought to myself, wouldn't it be a good idea to put a number on that and look at actually what's the hidden cost that we can calculate without thinking about the environmental aspects, just the hidden cost of all the electricity spent across all the miners, because that's who actually pays for it. For every transaction, that's not the block, but for every transaction that you do on Bitcoin, the actual cost that you don't see is just shy of $10. So when you start thinking about proof of stake economics, and you start thinking about, well, if people want to transact and swap value, and they want to use some digital means to do that, then whatever they use to do that, the cost from our perspective is trying to change how blockchains work. The benchmark is it's got to be less than $10. Now I know it's a lot less than $10, but when you start putting that that number out there, $10 per transaction with Bitcoin, and then you look at proof of stake and RChain, when you say those words, I think then people start to think, oh, hang on a minute, maybe these guys that are using proof of stake over in RChain have got something really quite important here, just as a utility. So it's kind of interesting that you raise the topic of proof of stake economics, because it's set in a backdrop where proof of stake proof of work solutions that are public have a hidden cost that nobody dares talk about. That doesn't include the environmental impact of the transaction.
Right. Wow. $10 a transaction seems
$10
really
that's also,
high. That's crazy,
isn't it? I mean, you wouldn't go to the bank and pay $10 to, for me to send you money, would you, Greg? You'd say, you're being done out of money there, Steve, if you're $10 to do that. And yet everyone that's doing a transaction with Bitcoin, the miners are the ones who are spinning, the compute resource. They don't see it as a big number, but if you add it all up and aggregate it, apparently that's kind of what it's looking like.
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, your analysis is, in many ways, the trying to get closer to the actual cost of transactions. If I've understood you correctly, being more inclusive in terms of the way we cost out our transactions. That's exactly the right kind of analysis that has to be done, in my opinion. But I think that lines up with the next step in the argument that I'm making, which is that the nice thing about proof of work is a proof of stake is that it lines up with the market requirements in order to move people from proof of work over to proof of stake. So in order to move people over, you have to have a much greater volume of transactions. And what we're seeing with the proof of stake algorithms is that they support a much greater volume of transactions. So this is important. But then the other side of it is that you have to lower the fees of transactions. And this was becoming clear to me by the end of 2016 as I started talking to people who are considering real world dApps. For example, could you do identity dApps for something at the scale of an entire nation state, where you do have these massive transaction volumes, and you need to make it cost out in such a way that whoever is supporting that transaction load in terms of server infrastructure and software infrastructure, can get a profit after the transaction fees. The transaction fees are prohibitive, right? Because you only have so much money that you can spend out of the space. So for example, if the government is supporting these identity-based transactions, there's really a cap on the amount of dollars that can be spent. And if all of it's eaten up in transaction fees, then it's a no-go. It's literally, you've just eliminated that entire market. And if you go and do each market analysis, what you discover is that you have to drop the transaction fees, at least as measured by the Ethereum network or the Bitcoin network, by 2 orders of magnitude to get even close to the kinds of market at scale that we'd like to see. But there's a nice economics here, right? So if we can, in our first leap, we can get to about 3 orders of magnitude greater transaction volume, but we only have to drop the transaction fees by 2 orders of magnitude, then we can attract the miners who have now become validators. We can attract that market because they can now get 10x on what they were seeing before, right? So if a miner was seeing on the order of $1 million a week in transaction fees, because they're getting 3 orders of magnitude, in other words, 1,000 times more transaction volume, but they're only charging 1% of the transaction fees, they're now getting a 10x or $10 million per week take off of the transaction fees. So that's good economics, and that's more or less the kind of economics, the kind of back of the envelope scale that you have to have if you're going to move people off of their vested infrastructure, right? You basically need a 10x improvement to attract the economic interest. Again, this is just standard VC kind of stuff, right? If a VC is going to put money into your project and accept the risk, they need to see a 10x return over a period of time. So the numbers line up almost perfectly. This is the next step in a chain of reasoning that gets us to a particular market approach. That's a lot to take in. I just want to stop there and see. Isaac and Steve, does that make sense to you as an argument?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, like you were saying, people have invested lots of money to build an infrastructure to mine, say, Bitcoin, for example, or Ethereum. And so you have to give them the right incentives to make them want to switch over. And, a promise of 10xing their profits is probably highly desirable.
So in my simplistic view of all this, I kind of started looking, because I had to talk to the University of Third Age, I had to talk to them about volatility. And they all asked me for investment advice. And of course, I did tell them, don't ask me for investment advice. I'm the last person you should ask on the planet. But nevertheless, I told them a little bit about why I felt that cryptocurrencies in particular are very volatile. And a lot of it is, we all hear that it's said from financial service companies, it's a currency with no asset, so it can go to zero. It's actually not true that it's not got an asset. It starts off with very little asset, but the asset grows, oddly enough, as the transaction volumes rise. And the higher the transaction volumes at any 1 second, so looking at that rate of transactions, the more valuable, ultimately, the backing behind the currency becomes. And so the currency itself, the token, has a higher imputed value as a result, because the asset is seen as important. Now, when you're the Bank of England, you've got gold. When you're the Federal Reserve, you've got gold, all these other assets. But when you're a blockchain with a crypto token that's representing value, the only asset you have is how popular you are. And the only measure of that popularity that actually makes commercial sense and fiscal sense is actually the volume of the transaction. So you can kind of see why it's not just about the proof of stake needing larger volumes of transactions. Actually, the argument's bigger. Blockchain as a whole needs to stabilize. And the only way it can stabilize is to increase the total volume of transactions, so that when we look at the token and we say, well, what's the probability of that token being worth zero? Like, all the tokens get stolen overnight. It's a very low probability, in the same way that when we look at the dollar or the pound and we say, what's the probability of the asset that backs it being stolen overnight, or stopping overnight, or going to zero value overnight, is also a very low probability. And there's a threshold. And I think the issue for the previous incarnations of in the crypto world, and the fact that they can't do the volumes of transactions, is precisely why you have volatility. And I think that the proof of stake and the concurrency that's certainly inbuilt into our chain addresses that concern. And if we're right in our thinking economically, then it will stabilize the entire market, not just with our chain, but anyone else seeking to increase that volume of transactions. So I think the discussion about proof of stake economics and the need for large volumes of transactions is not just about proof of stake. This is about the whole blockchain space. I just think we're at the head of it.
Steve, you are absolutely spot on this. I'm so glad you made that point. That is a really, really good point. And it lines up with the next series of points that I want to make.
I didn't rehearse any of this, by the way.
If we take as stipulated, of course, it's the magic of our chain, right? It's like the magic of our chain is that we are following the wave of the inevitable, right? We're not doing anything that isn't basically completely dictated by necessity, right? If you sit down and you do the math, you do the argumentation, there's just a bunch of necessary steps that have to be taken, right? And it's actually worthwhile to go and do that math and become aware of what is necessary in order for the operation to be viable. And you've just pointed out something that is again a part of that, necessary elements of the landscape. Building on your point, if we take it as stipulated that transaction volume is also directly correlated to the volatility of the token, then the next step is, if you have a market that is high risk, in the sense that if you draw 1, 2, 3 transactions on the floor, then the market, the transaction volume is at risk of going away precipitously, then it becomes absolutely clear how you have to go to market. To put some more color on this, if you try to go after, for example, air traffic control, and you drop one transaction on the floor and a plane crashes, people will run screaming from your platform. There will be no forgiveness because there was loss of human life. So as a result, you can't go after markets that have that kind of risk profile. So you eliminate any markets that have to do with loss of human life. You eliminate any markets that have to do with loss of high dollar values, so like billions, trillions to billions, possibly even down to millions. Those markets are a no-go in terms of your first go-to-market. And why? Because we know that first iteration of the software, it is quite likely that despite all of our best efforts for quality control, there will be bugs. In some sense, this is just the wisdom that we got from Web 2.0, right? Very, very few people were going to run screaming to the courts if a Facebook post didn't make it, or got deleted accidentally or anything like that. Very, very few people are going to run screaming to the courts about their Snapchat posts, or songs going missing, or anything like that. So the distribution of low risk digital assets is a very natural thing to do, and was essentially the building blocks for Web 2.0 for companies like Google and Facebook and others to roll out a global scale infrastructure. And then, having proven it out at scale and ironed out all the kinks, go after higher and higher risk markets. This is sort of a tried and true approach to the market that we've seen Apple use and Google use and Facebook use. So there's nothing surprising, nothing weird about first going after global scale on low risk digital assets. Once you've proven it out, you've seen 5 years of operation with no serious hiccups, then you can consider other kinds of markets, higher risk markets, such as supply chain management, or even higher risk markets, like global finance. So let me stop there and make sure that line of argumentation makes sense to both of you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I've heard you talk a little bit about this topic before. I think it was in an interview you did before becoming president of RChain, something along those lines. And you were talking about how maybe we had made a mistake in, immediately applying Bitcoin to world finances and trying to take over the financial system, or overhaul it rather. And maybe instead we should have had an app for a dating site or something along those lines, where you can actually use some of the features of the blockchain, but maybe a little lower stakes than billion-dollar financial transactions. So yeah, absolutely, that makes sense.
Mm. Yeah, makes sense to me too. I mean, and I remember you talking in similar way at Archon in Berlin. Yeah, because I suppose I've been on RChain Europe all this time as well, and we've been talking about decentralization and social structures and how we work together as human beings. You know, my thoughts always turn to, you know, the visionary statements on the front page of the RChain website with the movie. You know, we're all mad enough to think that we're contributing somehow to saving the world, which is kind of partly why we're doing it, right? So, you know, that is true for pretty much everyone I know in the community. You know, I'm kind of thinking about how do you roll it out? Where should the validators be? If I could wave a magic wand and have enough validators and do it in a particular locale. So if I just pick the UK, I'd love to be able to offer an alternative to every single community that has its own coinage. So, you know, I know they have this in America too. We have the Lewis pound, and there's the Totnes pound, and there's lots of communities that are very cooperative in nature, and they do exchange value. So if you go to Findhorn, which I know Greg's been to, there's a Facebook page where people are exchanging value all the time, every day. It may be to get a lift, but it's a value exchange. Whatever it is, it's a value exchange, and it's remembered. What gets really interesting is how you get those communities to talk to communities near them. You know, so if you're trading fruit and veg, you're not going to be doing it over 1,000 miles. You're going to do it to the co-op nearest to you, and other co-ops that have other things that you're interested in. And I think one of the most interesting prospects once mainnet's live and we've kicked the tires on it is to be able to go and visit a number of those cooperatives, understand how they're structured, and see if we can make it super easy for them to plug in as a validator. So each one having a validator, owning a validator. So it's a bit like Jim's validator pool in Florida, but centered around this notion of people wanting to work a different way in terms of fair value exchange. You imagine what would happen if we could get enough of them so that those validator nodes start to talk to each other. They're joining a mesh and they're co-owning it with everybody else. The problem with banks, there's two problems with banks. First of all, you know, what we would do from an RChain perspective, I think, once we're able to compete on that level, is it's very disruptive, because an awful lot of the money they get right now is about being the intermediary. So they then have to look for what is it they have to do to stay alive. There must be other financial products. And that gets quite challenging, because, you know, insurance can be crowdfunded and all sorts of other things. So it's starting to make them uncomfortable. And part of the reason for talking about co-op and how to sort of co-ops and using, you're becoming validators, creating those pools and then connecting up, is because if we're going to really succeed, I really do think that James Lovelock, who's one of my guides in all this, his words are probably the most important for us all to understand, which is act locally, but think globally. So acting locally, getting those co-ops on board, talking to them, getting all our software ready so that they can do that, but with that global vision that binds us all. That's a really good way, I think, of starting to have the large volumes of transactions that are very meaningful in a social dimension as well. It's not just about the transaction. It's about common ownership and all of those things.
Again, you're absolutely spot on. And there's an economic dimension to that as well, which lines up with how information flows in these social networks. Again, there's tons of market data on this. We've looked at a range of distribution of digital assets applications. And there's tons of market data on exactly those kinds of applications. So in particular, if we were to go to the end user route, right? So we're trying to build up network effects to get transaction volumes at the level of the end user. We know from the market data on WhatsApp and Snapchat and Facebook and all of the other social networks, which are effectively digital asset distribution platforms. We know the user acquisition spend. Minimal, it's something on the order of $19 per head. which means that just to acquire the first 1 million users, you're talking about a $20 million spend. So the go-to-market spend, if you don't have some kind of meaningful interaction, is quite high. It's way too high for a blockchain institution at this point. It means that you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars to get the kind of network effects that you need in order to generate the transaction volumes that we've already talked about as necessary. Following exactly your intuition, Steve, you have to approach people through the meaning in their lives. Are the interactions amongst them that sort of brings people together? And that's where, when we go to the arts and entertainment sector, right, that's where people begin to feel some of that meaningful interaction. And the example I like to use in these arguments, so when Taylor Swift announced in November of 2018 her feelings about the participation in the electoral process, 65,000 people registered to vote that day. So let that sink in, right? So if you wanted to move 65,000 people in one day, then you want to go to the thought leaders and the influencers and have them do the work for you. That's the basic point. And again, it's a point that's been well understood for a long period of time. There's nothing magic here. There's nothing, there's no kind of giant leap of technological insight, right? It's just go to the people who are thought leaders, who are innovators, who have influence within these social networks that we're trying to develop in order to bring transaction volume. And music is a particularly good one, right? Because it really is structured in that way. You have someone who has a certain kind of skill and talent that they've developed, and a lot of people respond to that or resonate with that skill and talent. So if we were thinking about building out network effects, then what we'd want to do is get the right 100 artists. If you could approach them in a way that you had something that was very compelling to them, then if each one of them had a following of only 1 million people with not too much crossover from artist to artist, 100 artists constitutes 100 million potential adherents or users of the platform in order to get to whatever the artist is offering. If each one of those 100 million users only listened to an offering from one of these artists 10 times a month, which is an extremely conservative number, then you now have 1 billion transactions on your platform inside a month. That's the kind of transaction volume that you need, and it's the right risk profile. And it lines up exactly with what you're saying, right? Whenever you look at these kind of social movements, and this really is a social movement, music has always been a part of that social movement. It's a way that we come together, harmonize with each other, literally, around certain expression of our shared ideology, our shared worldview. So again, it's sort of path of least resistance kind of argumentation.
So the world of these smaller co-ops, these communities, right? It's a very similar world to the world of music festivals. In fact, the cross-pollination between them is pretty intense. There's a lot of people that go from community to community and go to festivals on the way. And there's a lot of at a lot of those festivals, and I remember that Tim in Berlin, Tim, went to the Burning Man festival, and I know that at Glastonbury last year there was a lot of talk about decentralization, and inevitably technology is talked about at some of these, and blockchain being a decentralized thing, it's talked about. So it seems to me that actually, the strategy of seeing if you can sign up enough artists who care, right? They've got to be well enough known, and they've got to care. Signing that up and actually telling them, look, this is what we're planning to do. We want to get you guys on this Arsong platform, and hey, there's some good goodies in there for you too. But actually, this is a much bigger thing, and the much bigger thing is, go back out there and talk to those communities. The ones that have those little workshops in the tent at the festivals. the ones you guys like, go talk to them, reach out to them and get them to embrace this idea and become validator pools, right? You don't need to be a computer scientist to set that up. You can be a fairly low weight. I mean, and other people can help, and I'm sure will help in the community.
Mm-hmm.
But it does make sense to do that, because whilst you get the big bang on volume of transactions with music streaming, what you get is a massive, and I think that's what you're saying with Greg, you get this massive network effect, but it's not just a network effect that's sort of undirected. This is a very directed network effect by going after these sorts of communities, because they're natural allies to the places where a lot of those musicians hang out. I'm sure you've seen this, Greg, because I suspect you go to those festivals too.
Yeah, that's also that's a way of bringing it home. I like that kind of argumentation. It brings people back to a sort of an experiential basis for what we're talking about. A lot of what I'm talking about is really just arithmetic. If we're going to get to certain numbers, how do we get there with the least amount of spend, right, and the least amount of effort? And you're sort of adding that sort of felt dimension to it in terms of where do you see this, and that's exactly right. And one really good example, to bring it home to technologists who might not be musicians, is when Larry and Sergey from Google were basically, it was handed to them, you must get a CEO, right? The board said, you guys just can't be CEOs anymore. You've got to get a CEO. And so they did like a year-long search for a CEO for Google, and they just couldn't make a decision based upon the data alone. So they had all these great candidates for CEO. And what ended up being the differentiating thing, it was Burning Man. Eric Schmidt had been to Burning Man. And Burning Man is considered kind of the thought leadership mecca for Silicon Valley. So what you're saying is not some far-fetched, hippy-dippy thing. It's like right in the center of the evolution of one of the largest tech companies ever. So you are spot on, as usual, Steve. I just love it. The other point I want to make is again, it comes down to using small network effects to generate large network effects. And so when we're talking about how do we bring these thought leaders to the table? Like how would we get musical artists who have followers or audiences in the millions? How would we get them to the table? And we've done lots and lots of analysis on this at RCast. And it turns out that despite the fact that, Spotify and Google and Amazon are currently suing songwriters for a long delayed jump in royalties, despite the fact that the distribution mechanisms are literally going after artists to try, and these artists are basically just asking for an economic participation that is fair, that will keep them in the game. Right? And like when you have world-class artists like David Torn getting, a check for $8 for just like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of plays of one of their tunes, then basically what you're saying is we don't want the creative classes, because there's no way someone can develop and maintain a craft at the world-class level if their craft doesn't support them. And we all know this is true, not just in music, but even Olympic scale athletes. We know that despite the fact that they're so-called amateur, they're really being supported by all kinds of sponsors and advertisements and those kinds of things. So when you're at world-class level, it's not a hobby. It's an all-consuming full-time gig. And if you don't have some kind of economic support for that, you're just not going to be able to do it. The best of the best are making, pennies for their efforts. Then we're just simply talking about wiping out the creative classes, right? So even in those economic conditions, a fair reporting and accounting system that puts the artist in direct contact with their supporters is still not sufficient to move the artist. Now, it's strange. It's an unusual situation, but when we've done the market analysis and we've done it, that's just the way of it. It's not enough to say, you know what, we'll eliminate all this weird hidden royalty reporting and accounting. We're going to put you in a setting, a blockchain-based setting where there's an immutable record of the royalties, and there's no way that someone's going to obscure the path of the use of the content and how that relates to getting paid. That's still not enough to move the artist. There's some irony there, and probably an explanation for why artists are not making the kinds of money that they should be making. But that's a fact. And so there has to be some other piece of an offering that makes it work for the artist. So at least in the case of our chain, what we said was, what if you gave the artist an audio capability that was the new world of audio experience? It was like the next dimension in audio experience. And we tested that out with hundreds of artists. And that was enough to move the dial. Mm-hmm. So again, the argument is really straightforward. We know that we have to get to transaction volumes. We want to minimize the user acquisition spend. We'd like to drop the user acquisition spend by at least an order of magnitude, if not more. And so we look to markets which are high volume, low risk, that have key influencers that move millions of people at a time. And then we say, what's going to attract those key influencers to come to the platform? Then we do the analysis and we say, okay, the blockchain piece of it is not sufficient. It's necessary, but it's not enough to get them to jump. And then we ask, what is going to get them to jump? And we say, based upon our market testing, what gets them to jump is this next generation audio technology. And then we just do a really, really simple back of the envelope comparison. What would you spend on that would still knock off an order of magnitude in terms of your user acquisition spend? So we know what the user acquisition spend it was for WhatsApp and Facebook, right? And that's in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So if you drop it down to even tens of millions of dollars, then you have met your goal. That's the basic idea. To me, it's the kind of business analysis that might, escape certain people, but also, I think one of the things that I've seen when I talk to people who are more socially active and in the platform for socially active reasons, when I make these kinds of business sorts of arguments, they feel like I've left the heart behind. That I've turned into a bean counter, and and they wonder what I'm talking about. With respect to our chain, it sort of works the other way around. We look at everything both from this socially active and heartfelt perspective, and also from this hyper-rational, business-oriented perspective. And we're looking for those solutions which are right down the middle, that satisfy both goals. So that if you're just cold-hearted, looking at the numbers, what's the path to take? And if you're also like all heart and looking at what's going to save the planet, it also satisfies those constraints. And this argument does both. And that's the thing that sometimes is hard to get your head around, right? Because it's literally an approach that embraces both worlds at the same time. So what we've done is we've gone through the validator economics. We said for proof of stake, what do we have to do? We arrive at certain transaction volumes, and then we say, to get those transaction volumes, what kind of risk profile does it have to match? and that identifies particular markets. And then when we look at the approach to each of those markets, we say, oh, wow, we need to go to the influencers to minimize our acquisition spend. And then we analyze what's going to attract those influencers. And then we check and see if the cost of that attractor is less than the cost of going directly to the end users. And that's what lands you in a DApp like our song, or a DApp like Arterial, or those kinds of, or even a DApp like Proof. That's the kind of analysis that goes into selecting for those kinds of dApps.
Well, whilst you were talking, I had this sort of vision of what would I really like to do this summer. And it's the Brighton Festival coming up, and my wife has signed me up to a silent disco tour of Brighton, where you walk around Brighton with headphones on and dance around. Nobody knows what you're listening to, and you do it in a group. And I'm just thinking, whilst you were talking about all of that, and about, if I was Ed Sheeran or somebody like that, and somebody demonstrated to me the richness of the sound from the codec, right? And also told me about the ethos of our chain and stuff like that, I'd probably be quite excited if somebody could get to him. I would imagine he'd be excited. And if you said, hey, we're going to be at Glastonbury and we're going to do a silent disco. The challenge is whether we can get the same impact with wireless headphones. It might mean that you need wired, but let's say they were wired and you did that silent disco, and you got some major musician to say, hey, you should go to the silent disco tent at Glastonbury on this day. Can you imagine what it would be like for those people walking out after that? They'd have just gone through a much more immersive experience in the silent disco as it is. Probably one of those experiences that you think, oh my God, that was amazing experiences. And then if you've got that backed up with some press coverage that follows it, you start building that movement really quickly. I'm just putting that out there as a madcap idea because I'm having to go to my first silent disco in about a month. And I'm going to be seen for the really bad dancer that I really am all through Brighton. But I'm going to do it anyway.
I love it. I'll be honest. And the thing is that when we talk about network effects, it really is butterfly flapping its wings and starting a hurricane. That you're exactly right. And this was the point I was trying to make about Eric Schmidt and Google and Burning Man. What you're talking about is exactly that kind of phenomenon where you just have to learn how to pay attention. What are the tiny acts you can make locally that have this kind of, it's a small scale network feeding into large scale network. And what you're talking about is exactly that phenomenon. And that's really the same thing that we've been talking about the whole time, is what are the small scale network acts that we can do, like attracting, the right kind of independent artist to build out the large scale network effects. So with Ethereum, a lot of it was attracting the developer. And our chain is still 110% committed to attracting the developer. But we also know that the developer is only going to follow this market if they actually see that there's a bang for buck. When they apply their mad skill to the space, that they're going to see a big 10x return on their efforts. And that was kind of the whole ICO craze. But that's gone. It's over. It's done, right? So the next wave, you have to attract the developer in a different way, and you have to start going from the developer to other kinds of communities. And that's essentially what this has been about, is what are the next communities? So in some ways, coders are the creative class of tech, and then artists are the creative class of music and other kinds of content. And so they're the next natural step. I love your idea, Steve. I think it's spot on with what we're trying to talk about. Isaac, you want to take us out? Any thoughts or comments?
Well, so you were saying the R-chain approach is kind of like catering to both sides, people who strictly care about the numbers and maybe people who strictly care about like doing what's right or their morality or something. Quite honestly, I think now that you've kind of said it, it's almost obvious, right? Like you want to appeal to the most people possible, and if we can appeal to everybody from, one end to the spectrum to the other, then I mean, that's just seems like the best approach anyways. But it also, just from like a purely economic approach, like we're trying to reach the most people possible to make this platform successful because we believe in it. And yeah, I mean, it just makes a lot of sense.
Well, I'll highlight one network effect. I mean, and this is kind of the world we're in, right? I mean, this next 12 to 18 months will be quite critical. Yeah. Greta Thunberg. I hope you all know who she is. If you don't, you should do.
Absolutely.
Right? Look what she did. Well, she started by deciding to go on strike herself. And now, tomorrow, I'm going down to Brighton to support students who are leaving school once a month in the UK across 60 different locations. They have self-organised. What they lack is a trusted platform in which to continue to do that. That's what I want to give them.
Yeah, cool.
You are absolutely, that is finger on the pulse as usual, Steve. That is precisely it. Greta Thunberg is the butterfly flapping its wings.
Totally.
And the response from students around the world is the hurricane. And I view our chain as that amplification tool that allows people like Greta to flap their wings and strike up that hurricane. That's exactly it.